Well, I guess it's time that I address the whole tank controversy regarding Ukraine. By the way, I'm not breaking my word. This is not a battlefield update. But this is about the politics of the war in Ukraine and how it's affecting us here in the West. The new cause celeb in the Ukraine war is, the new dividing line as to whether or not you're a patriotic Westerner or you're a Russian puppet is whether or not you want to send specifically tanks to Ukraine. Now, in the West, we've been sending bombs and missiles to Ukraine and missile defense systems, but I guess things like tanks, we haven't been. In fact, Ukraine, once upon a time, was a big producer of tanks. So I'm not sure what happened to that. I guess the Ruskies maybe have destroyed that factory by now, but I thought the Ruskies were doing a terrible job in the war, and they were ineffective and not being able to get anything done. So, if that's the case, I would be surprised that the Ruskies were able to take down Ukraine's tank factory. But who knows? Maybe Russia's not as incompetent as we thought, and they're actually taking out Ukraine's vital military infrastructure, which is why the Ukrainians are now short of tanks. Something that we heard very early on was that the Ukrainians were losing a lot of tanks in the war, but we were told that they were capturing so many Ruski tanks that it didn't really matter, because the Ruskies, they were so scared, they were so undertrained and malnourished as soldiers that as soon as they saw the Ukrainian flag over the horizon, they would run, they would drop all their weapons, they would crawl out of their tanks and run in the other direction as the Ukrainians shot them in the back. Because they were so afraid and they knew that they were outgunned. And so the Ukrainians were just coming into all of this military equipment from Russia. They were capturing so many tanks. This is what we were told by the pro-Ukraine media. So it really is quite odd to me at this point. If the Ukrainians have been capturing Russian tanks for a year now, I would think that they would be the Ruskies who are low on tanks and the Ukrainians who are flush. I would think that the Ukrainians probably have more tanks than people at this point. They don't have enough people to operate them because they've gotten so many tanks that they've won in their victories against Russia. Of course, in case you couldn't tell, I'm being rather facetious. I never really believed those stories about the Ukrainians just capturing all the Russian tanks. I'm sure there were isolated incidents. I'm sure you could find videos of captured Russian tanks. I'm sure you could find videos of the Russians capturing Ukrainian tanks. But at the end of the day, if the Uknats are this desperate for tanks, it means that they're getting destroyed in battle. And I could understand that after a year of fighting a hard battle on your own soil. When I believe that tank factory was somewhere in the southeast. So who knows? Maybe the factory itself is under Russian control now. I should look into that after I'm done recording this. It's understandable that the Ukrainians would be low on supply of tanks and might need to import them. But that contradicts the narrative. This is a problem when you paint such a pretty picture about how well the Ukrainians are doing. And you say how they're so invincible and how the Russians suck so much, but the Ukrainians can't survive without constant injections of Western equipment and money. That, to me, would seem to indicate that the Ukrainians are in fact quite weak, and that they've only been kept on life support by billions and billions, or probably trillions at this point, of injections of Western hardware. The implication of this whole tank debate seems to be that Ukraine is not a viable military, and that it is completely reliant on these Western handouts. And so that's why it's not so much a matter of, okay, do you think that the Ukrainians should be given more tanks? It's, you must be willing to give them every last tank in your inventory, or else you're trying to help Russia. Because no matter how many or how few tanks you have in your inventory, or no matter how expensive they are, and how much you don't want to lose, billions of dollars in military hardware, Ukraine needs your tanks more than you do. And so, as we all believe in the West, to each according to his need, from each according to his ability, Germany, which is a very able country, should produce a lot of tanks, and Ukraine, which which has a big need for tanks, should receive those tanks. Such is the communist logic of the Western establishment. So, the divide right now seems to be between mainly countries led by Poland, who want to send every last tank in the NATO bloc to Ukraine, and Germany, who, this seems to be Germany's stance, while they understand why other countries might want to do that, Germany does not want to join them. Poland, because Germany is, I guess, the lone holdout in not sending tanks to Ukraine, because Germany, they don't really want to escalate in that way. They're not comfortable with sending that kind of hardware to the Ukrainians. Poland is saying that Germany is on the wrong side of history. Of course, this is just Germans being Germans. They're authoritarians at heart, which, I agree with. And that if the Germans were, real Westerners, if the Germans were truly better than the Ruskies, well, the Germans would give every last tank in their inventory and, of course, convert all their factories, BMW, Mercedes-Benz. They should be converted into making tanks too, just like, in World War II. The entire West should be in a wartime economy, and we should be sending all of this hardware to the front lines of freedom, so-called, in Ukraine. This is what the Poles mean. I used to be quite sympathetic towards Poland and their government. I used to think, hey, out of all the Europeans, the Poles seem to be on the more reasonable side. Even more so at a time, than Hungary. Poland was a little bigger, more prominent, but ever since the 2022 and the start of this war, quickly the Poles have been exposed as being just completely deranged and irrational on the topic of anything to do with Russia. The Hungarians, which have just as much reason to have a long-standing, deep-seated hatred for the Russian people. They have the prejudice would be just as understandable in the Hungarian parts. The Hungarians are just much more rational. They're much more objective, it would seem. And Viktor Orban says, hey, you know what? I have nothing to gain by throwing my rather small and economically weak countries' weight behind a loser like Ukraine. We just don't have anything to gain. And frankly, he has a lot to lose. The Druzhba pipeline feeding energy to Hungary, the Ruskies could turn that off, on a dime, and the Hungarians would be in real bad shape. The Poles, however, don't think that way. The Poles only think in terms of sticking it to the Ruskies. The Polish foreign policy is driven entirely by Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin controls Poland because whatever he does, they'll do the opposite. If Vladimir Putin was aligned with Ukraine and he invaded, China, well, then the Poles would be saying, oh my gosh, we have to help Beijing. There's no freer country on earth than China. Anyone who doesn't support China is an enemy of freedom and a fascist. And, some of you probably aren't even going, hey, that's ridiculous. What are you talking about? Because you know what? You thought about it to yourself and you said, you know what? No, that actually makes sense. I think they would do that. Because Ukraine, before this war, would anyone have said, Ukraine, that's a bastion of freedom? No, it's a corrupt hellhole. And what is it since the war started? Well, it's an even worse corrupt hellhole because now it's an active war zone. Now, to be fair, Donbass has been an active war zone since 2014, but even more of Ukraine now is become completely unlivable. And on top of that, they've just completely outlawed all opposition. There's no defense for Ukraine, like from a civil liberties standpoint. And so that's why I say the Poles have absolutely zero political principles. I would expect this sort of hypocrisy and indifference towards tyranny from Washington, but I used to have more respect for Warsaw. No longer. How bad do you have to be on foreign policy to be worse than the Germans? The Germans have never had a good foreign policy that I can think of. I don't know, maybe under Helmut Kohl in the 80s? Kinda. Although, never mind, Kohl was behind German reunification, and that was a disaster. Still is. East Germany would be much better off if it was still a separate country. You can take down the Berlin Wall. You can unite Berlin, the city, I guess. And you can have, freedom of movement maybe between East and West Germany, and they can trade with one another, and East Germans could shop in West Berlin. Yeah, that'd be great. But now these people are stuck living under the boot of these self-hating West Germans. A self-governing modern East Germany would be, I contend, a much better country to live in, and a much more rational and reasonable government than the one that currently occupies power in Berlin. But even still, even that cartoonishly childish, red-green coalition, led by Olaf Scholz, the great oaf that he is. Even that government is more rational and reasonable on the matter of Ukraine than Poland. And now we have Poland talking about starting up their own bloc. Hey, if Germany won't join us in going to war with Russia and fighting a third world war, well, then we'll just do it on our own. all the ex-Soviet republics and Soviet satellite states, minus Hungary, they'll all team up, form the Intermarium, and fight World War III. And if Germany doesn't want to be a part of it, so be it. That's Poland's attitude. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.